The blade came from nowhere. Cade Torren dropped low, felt the displacement of air where his throat had been a half-second earlier. His training partner, 7 feet of simulated Sarath warrior, flowed into the next strike without pause. Beautiful economy of motion. Lethal precision. He rolled left, came up speaking. Threvakar Samoranth. The words felt like stones in his mouth. Heavy, deliberate, each syllable weighted with meaning that went deeper than translation. The simulation froze mid-strike. Arya's voice cut through the training base sharp as the blade that had nearly opened his neck. Tonal error in the second register, Cade. You just declared war instead of requesting peace. He straightened, breathing hard. Sweat ran down his spine in the recycled air of the station gym. What did I miss? The emotional inflection dropped a quarter tone on Samoranth. In Valar, that shifts the grammatical frame from diplomatic request to military ultimatum. A pause. The kind of pause only an AI could make feel judgmental. You've been studying for 3 years. This should be automatic by now. Cade wiped his face with his forearm, stared at the frozen warrior. Even in holographic form, the Sarath were striking. Tall, graceful, built like violence wrapped in silver skin. Run it again. You've completed 16 combat linguistic scenarios today. Your error rate is increasing with fatigue. I said, run it again. The simulation reset. The warrior dissolved into pixels, then reformed. Blade raised. Those luminous eyes fixed on him with artificial intelligence that felt uncomfortably real. Cade had spent 3 years learning to see past those eyes, to understand the language behind them, to know what a Sarath warrior thought before they thought it. He'd learned their words, their grammar, the way emotion lived inside their syntax like a second heartbeat. He'd learned all of it in a small apartment with an AI he'd named Arya, because yelling at something with a name felt better than screaming at code. The blade came again. He spoke again. This time the warrior stopped, lowered the weapon, made the gesture of acknowledgement, palm pressed to forehead, then extended. Acceptable, Arya said. Cade let himself smile. Small victories. In 3 years, he'd collected thousands of them. Each one felt like stacking sandbags against a flood. You know, Arya said, in 72 hours, you'll be standing in a receiving line while actual Sarath warriors decide whether to restart a war that's killed 4 billion people across 12 years. Perhaps you should rest. In 72 hours, Cade said quietly, I'll use words like these to keep 8 billion more from dying. So no, run it again. The simulation reset. The blade came. Cade spoke. In 72 hours, those words and the understanding they represented would save 8 billion lives, would end a 12-year war, would forge a connection between two species that should have been impossible. But first, he had to master the pronunciation. The blade came again. 72 hours later, Cade stood in the receiving line and discovered that magnetic dress boots on polished obsidian were designed by someone who hated feet. The floor gleamed like frozen oil. The boots held him in place with the gentle insistence of a vice. He'd been standing for 40 minutes. The briefing document had promised this was within acceptable ceremonial parameters. The briefing document had been written by someone who'd never stood in 17 degrees Celsius while their body quietly rebelled against every warm-blooded instinct. He shifted his weight, 2 millimeters, maximum permissible movement before it became visible. He'd calculated it during the first 30 minutes. Mathematics was better than thinking about the cold. To his left stood Colonel Hendricks, a man whose career had spanned 4 planetary systems and who'd apparently made peace with physical discomfort during the second decade of it. Gray-haired, granite-faced. The kind of officer who made silences feel like orders. To his right stood Dr. Alara Voss, xenobiologist, and the closest thing Cade had to a friend in this delegation. She'd spent the last 20 minutes making small movements with her jaw. Internal speech rehearsal. He recognized the pattern. She'd reached a part she didn't like. The hall itself was extraordinary. Cade let himself observe it the way he'd learned was acceptable peripheral vision. Careful attention, nothing that could be mistaken for extended staring. The Sarath considered direct examination of their architecture a minor impropriety. Something between reading personal correspondence and arriving uninvited to a meal. The walls curved inward and at impossible angles. Stone that absorbed light at one perspective and returned it at another warmer and somehow changed. His inner ear translated the acoustic properties as a very low sound, though he knew intellectually there was no sound at all. The Sarath had been building in this style for 9 centuries. They had never once asked anyone else's opinion of it. Cade had learned about their architecture the same way he'd learned everything else about them, through their language. Because in Valar, the word for home was structurally identical to the phrase, place where sound settles correctly. You couldn't separate the building from its acoustic properties. You couldn't understand one without the other. That was how it always began for him. Not with politics or biology or trade implications, with the language. Because the language was where everything else lived. 3 years ago, age 25, discharged from active service with a medical retirement he hadn't wanted, and a hollow place in his chest that used to be his squad, Cade had found a research paper on Valar grammatical structures. He'd read it 4 times before moving on. Then he'd gone back and read it twice more. Then he'd never really left it. The language carried emotional register inside its grammar, the way other languages carried tense. It was structural, not decorative. Getting it wrong didn't just produce an accent. It produced a different sentence entirely. In his 8th month of study attempting to practice a formal greeting, he'd informed Arya that he was arriving with moderate regret and expected disappointment. Arya had noted this gently. Cade had made a note of his own, do not speak to anyone important until year 3. He was as of this morning in year 3. The doors at the far end of the hall opened without sound, which was itself a kind of sound. The sudden negative space of a room holding its breath. Cade felt the attention of every person in the line shift forward. Unified precision, sensor array achieving lock. He shifted with it. Queen Sirrus entered. She was taller than her documentation had suggested. 2.1 meters according to official records, but those were clearly measured sitting down or by someone who'd never seen her move through a space. 38 years old, 12 of them spent leading her people through war. She didn't walk, she flowed, unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with slowness. The opposite of slowness, because slowness implied awareness of speed, and she appeared entirely unaware that any other pace existed. Her skin held that distinctive silver blue of the Sarath warrior caste. Her eyes, amber luminous, unsettling, swept the receiving line with the bored efficiency of someone performing a task for the 1000th time. She spoke. It was preliminary, conventional in structure, the Valar equivalent of a temperature check, administrative machinery arranging itself while translators were located. Cade recognized the tonal register. Formal, inclusive, requiring no specific response, designed to fill air while humans scrambled to understand. Kale, the chief translator, was supposed to be standing 40 meters down the connecting corridor. Ready, prepared. The linchpin of communication between species that had spent 12 years trying to kill each other. Kale was not there. His translation equipment had suffered what would later be revealed as deliberate sabotage, a precisely timed malfunction arranged by Director Graves to create exactly this moment of silence. But Cade didn't know that yet. Kale was not there. Cade knew this because he could hear the particular quality of silence that meant someone important was missing from somewhere important. He knew this because Colonel Hendricks made a sound barely audible, technically a throat-clearing, functionally an entire document of diplomatic concern. He knew this because Queen Sirrus's eyes were now tracking along the line, mild interest sharpening into something else, something that looked like recognition of a problem. 3 seconds of silence. 4. 5. After 5 seconds, silence stops being the absence of sound and becomes a thing with weight, with opinions. Cade had spent 3 years preparing for a conversation he'd assigned a very low probability of ever having. His role on this mission was junior. Specific. He was attached to the delegation as a secondary linguistic consultant, which meant in practice that he read documents, prepared summaries, and stood in receiving lines while senior personnel conducted actual business. He had not prepared for this, but he'd prepared for something close enough. He answered her, not loudly, not with the energetic confidence of someone making a point, with the careful, slightly effortful accuracy of someone placing a word down precisely because they know how much it weighs. Threvana Solath Marstithir Shoratum. His second tone on Shoratum, the word for honored, was imperfect, marginally flat. He caught it halfway through, it corrected, felt the half-beat hesitation of a speaker, catching themselves mid-stride. In Valar, this was noticeable. It was also in context entirely legible. The room went quiet in the way of rooms that have just had something happen to them. Queen Sirrus looked at him. Her expression moved through surprise with what seemed like genuine speed, as though surprise was a country she hadn't visited in years and was passing through quickly on her way to somewhere more interesting. Cade stood very still, waited to find out where she was going. 4 seconds. He counted them. Old habit. High-pressure situations made him count things. He'd stopped being embarrassed about it around the time he'd stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. 4 seconds was the precise duration at which silence transitions from absence into presence. After 4 seconds, silence begins to have opinions. Queen Sirrus's expression, having passed through surprise, arrived at something Cade's 3 years of linguistic study hadn't entirely prepared him for. Because it wasn't a thing that lived in language. It lived in the fraction of a second between a person deciding to be interested and allowing that interest to show. She had let it show. She said something else. This one was faster. The grammatical structure shifted into what Cade recognized as interrogative evaluative, a form used historically in Sarath academic settings, specifically when a senior scholar wished to determine whether a junior one actually understood what they just said or had simply repeated it with adequate pronunciation. It was in the most precise possible terms a test. Arya had drilled him on this construction during 3 focused weeks he'd privately called the unpleasant autumn. He answered it. He didn't answer it perfectly. Midway through the response, he reached for a conditional clause, a structure in Valar, that required the speaker to indicate not only what might happen, but the degree of their personal investment in whether it did, and selected the wrong investment register on the first attempt. He caught this approximately 1 word after making it, which created an interesting situation. Because Valar contained a recognized self-correction form that was structurally identical to a specific mode of self-deprecating humor. The distinction came down entirely to tonal intent. Cade's tonal intent in that moment was genuine and slightly panicked. The result from outside was indistinguishable from a carefully deployed joke. Something changed in Queen Sirrus's expression. Something the rest of the room wasn't positioned to see, because they were all watching Cade with the focused attention of people witnessing either a historic diplomatic breakthrough or a career-ending incident, and not yet certain which. She was watching him with something adjacent to amusement, which in Sarath court culture was not a small register. Amusement was considered a form of respect, the acknowledgement that another person had produced something genuinely unexpected, which was apparently among the rarer gifts one could offer a queen who'd sat through 12 years of ceremonially arranged conversations. Behind them, from the connecting corridor, came the sound of someone walking quickly and trying not to show it. Kale arrived at dignified speed approximately 6 meters before becoming visible. Professional instinct, Cade could only admire. The translator was compact 50s, carrying in his interface unit that projected soft amber light. He had the particular expression of someone who'd just been told something in a corridor and was still processing the shape of it. He took his position, noted the Queen's orientation, noted Cade, noted the ambient quality of the room's silence, assembled these observations into a conclusion with practiced speed. His conclusion appeared to cause him feelings. A court aide materialized at his left elbow, spoke very quietly in the register Cade recognized as Sarath administrative tone for delivering information that required the recipient to pretend they'd already known it. Kyle listened. He nodded once, slow, accepting. A man watching a door close on something familiar. He deactivated the amber light on his translation unit. He stepped back. Colonel Hendricks made another sound. This one was longer than the first, had more syllables of diplomatic concern compressed into it. Cade did not look at him. Looking at Hendricks right now would require dividing his attention. His attention was currently deployed in full on the task of understanding what Queen Sirrus had just gestured toward. It was the seat beside her, not a secondary chair, not a position at the outer curve of the receiving arrangement. The seat beside her, this was a specific architectural statement in Sarath court protocol, a fact Cade knew from his reading, which was now sitting in the center of his thoughts like furniture that had appeared in a room without anyone moving it. He walked toward it. He was aware with the peripheral social awareness of someone who'd grown up in a large family and never fully lost the instinct that every diplomatic professional in the receiving line was watching him cross that floor. That their collective silence had a texture to it, dense, complicated, multi-layered, like a document with too many revision histories. Dr. Ilara Voss had stopped rehearsing her speech. Colonel Hendricks had achieved a stillness that suggested he was composing internal memoranda at speed. Cade sat down. The Queen looked at him. Direct, unperformed. The way cultural briefings had described, and he hadn't entirely believed until this moment. Because some things couldn't survive the transition from written description to actual experience. She said something else, quieter this time, meant for the space between two people rather than for a room. He leaned forward slightly, listened with everything he had. What she said quietly and for the space between them was this. She asked him how long he'd been studying Valar, and she asked it in the specific grammatical construction used between people who already know the answer will be surprising and are asking anyway because they want to hear the person say it themselves. Cade told her 3 years. He said it using the correct temporal register, which in Valar distinguished between time spent doing something because it was required and time spent doing something because you couldn't find a reason to stop. He used the second form. This was not a small distinction. It was grammatically speaking closer to confession than fact. She considered this for a moment. That particular quality of consideration that doesn't look like thinking because it's learned to happen beneath the surface. Then she asked him a follow-up question. This one had different texture entirely. It was personal in the way only Valar could be personal, because the language's emotional architecture made it nearly impossible to ask why someone had done something without also revealing that you found the answer genuinely worth knowing. She wanted to know why. Cade had prepared for many things in 3 years. Vocabulary, tonal registers, grammatical edge cases. A small but robust collection of self-corrections for the moments when his tongue and his intention briefly separated. He had not with any seriousness prepared for this question, because he had not seriously believed he would be sitting close enough to anyone important to be asked it. He told her the truth. This was partly the language's doing. The emotional register system made evasion technically possible but structurally ungainly, like trying to fit large furniture through a door that was almost wide enough. You could do it, but everyone present would be aware of the effort. He told her that he'd encountered a research paper on Valar grammar in his second year of general linguistic studies, that the paper had described the language's emotional architecture in a single sentence he'd read 4 times before moving on, then returned to twice more before closing the document, that he'd never entirely left that sentence. He told her because the grammar required him to commit to a register of sincerity that foreclosed the more comfortable option of making it sound academic, that he'd learned the language because he'd wanted to understand how her people thought before he said anything to them that mattered. The space between them went very still. She looked at him with an expression that had moved well past surprise and was now somewhere he didn't have a ready map for. Then she said something he had to ask her with genuine and undisguised care to repeat at slightly reduced speed, because she'd used a compound construction in the third tonal layer that he'd studied but not yet encountered in living speech, and he wanted to be certain he understood it before he responded to it. She repeated it without any visible impatience, which in her court culture was itself a form of statement. What she'd said was a Valar expression without direct human equivalent, a phrase that existed as a kind of honorific acknowledgement. It described a person who had arrived ahead of the moment that was supposed to introduce them, who had prepared for a conversation before being invited to it, who had in some essential way taken the relationship seriously before the relationship had formally begun. Cade's linguistic notes, compiled over 3 years in a document he'd titled with aggressive neutrality as Valar study reference, contained this expression in a subsection on idiomatic complements. He'd flagged it with a small star. The way he flagged things he found beautiful. He had not imagined it would be used in reference to him. He was aware in the distant and temporarily deprioritized portion of his attention, still monitoring the room, that things were happening behind him. He could hear the particular quality of very quiet professional conversation, the kind conducted by people who need to communicate urgently but cannot be seen to be communicating urgently. Someone was recalibrating expectations. Several someones, in fact. At speed. With the focused energy of people who'd prepared extensively for one version of an event and were now navigating a different one without a map. He returned his full attention to the Queen, because the Queen was asking him another question. And this one arrived in a register he recognized immediately. The Valar form for genuine curiosity, unfiltered by protocol. The kind of question asked not because an answer was required, but because the person asking it actually wanted to know. In 12 years of royal audiences conducted through translators and formal channels, he suspected this register hadn't seen much use. He found he very much wanted to answer it well. The question Queen Sirrus had asked in the register of genuine unfiltered curiosity was whether he had ever spoken Valar to another Sarath before today. He had not. He told her this with the grammatical form that indicated the absence of something one had been aware of wanting, which in Valar was more specific than simple negation. Carried with it an implicit acknowledgement of the waiting. 3 years of study conducted in a small apartment with an AI named Arya, in a language built for emotional honesty, And this was the first time it had been used for its intended purpose. Actual human to actual Sarath, in the same atmosphere, at a distance close enough to hear the tonal differences that no recording had ever quite captured. Sirrus was quiet for a moment. Then she said that this explained the slight formality of his register. She said it in a tone that wasn't criticism, something warmer. The observation of someone who'd noticed a detail and found the detail endearing rather than deficient. In Valar, the distinction between these two responses was grammatically enforced. You couldn't accidentally sound warm when you meant to sound critical. Cade had always found this particular feature of the language quietly extraordinary. Hearing it demonstrated in live speech aimed at him produced a sensation he didn't immediately have a category for. He told her because the language continued to make evasion structurally inconvenient that he was aware his register was formal, that this was partly study habit, partly the reasonable caution of someone who'd spent 3 years being corrected by software and was still updating his expectations about what it felt like to be understood. She laughed, not performed, not the social register of polite amusement deployed at appropriate intervals during ceremonial functions. This was brief and genuine and arrived slightly ahead of whatever expression she'd been composing, which meant it hadn't been approved before departure. In 12 years of court audiences, Cade was fairly certain this hadn't happened on schedule either. Behind him, the room recalibrated. He felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatically, but with the specific physical certainty of something having shifted. Colonel Hendricks made another sound, shorter than the first, different quality, less concerned, more something that in a less formal context might have been described as reluctant reassessment. Sirrus asked him something new. She asked it in the register for hypothetical reflection, a grammatical mode used when a speaker wished to explore an idea without committing to it as position or belief, a kind of linguistic safe space for thinking out loud. She asked him what he'd expected this moment to be like before it happened. Cade considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He told her that he hadn't expected the moment at all, not in any operational sense. He'd known in the abstract way one knows things that live in the future as possibilities, rather than plans that he might one day be in a room where a Sarath was present. He had not constructed any serious scenario in which he was the person speaking. His role on this mission was junior and specific. He was attached to the trade division as a secondary linguistic consultant, which meant in practice that he read documents, prepared summaries, and stood in receiving lines in magnetic boots, while senior diplomats conducted actual business. He told her, reaching for the emotional register that was always easier than approximation in Valar, that he'd spent 3 years preparing for a conversation he'd assigned a very low probability of ever having, that the preparation had never felt like a waste, because the language itself had been worth the time regardless of whether it was ever used. She was quiet again, the kind of quiet that wasn't absence but accumulation. Then she said something that moved into a register Cade had not expected and had to track carefully. The Valar mode for personal disclosure, the grammatical form that marked a statement as something the speaker was choosing to share rather than required to offer. She told him that the translation protocol existed because, in her experience, visitors to the Sarath court were afraid of being misunderstood. She told him that this fear was reasonable and that the protocol served it well. She told him that he was the first person who had arrived appearing to be afraid of something different. Cade sat with this for a moment. Outside the hall's upper atmospheric filters, the orbital station's positional system made its hourly adjustment, a process that produced no sound inside the building, but was registered by the floor as the faintest possible shift, the kind the human body detected before the mind caught up with it. Cade felt it, noted it, returned to the Queen who was watching him with the expression of someone who'd asked a question inside a statement and was waiting to see if he'd heard both. He had heard both. He reached carefully for the right register, found it, told her what the difference was in his own words in her own language. What he told her was this, that the difference as he understood it was the direction of the fear. That most people who came to her court afraid of being misunderstood were worried about their own meaning, that something they intended would arrive distorted, that the machinery of translation would lose something essential in transit, that they would be heard as something other than what they were, that this was a reasonable fear and he'd felt versions of it himself, but that his fear, the one that had driven 3 years of study in a small apartment with a software tutor he'd named Area and would now apparently never need to explain, had been oriented differently. He had been afraid of misunderstanding her, of arriving in this room with the full confidence of someone who had been briefed and prepared and professionally equipped and nonetheless hearing something other than what was being said, of walking away from a conversation with a Sarath and believing he'd understood it when he'd only understood its surface. The way you can read the words of a poem in a language not your own and follow the sentences perfectly and miss the poem entirely. Sirrus listened to this without interrupting, which in Velar conversational culture was not a passive act. The language had a specific grammatical form for responsive listening, small tonal acknowledgments woven into the silence between a speaker's sentences. Not words exactly, more like punctuation that breathed. She used them. Cade heard them and felt in a way he hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely account for that he was being heard in the full sense of the word rather than the functional one. When he finished, she said that this was an unusual thing for a diplomat to admit. She said it in the register of observation rather than criticism, but with a warmth underneath it that the grammar made visible whether she intended it to be visible or not. Velar did this to its speakers, had a way of showing what you meant even when you were being careful. The way certain fabrics show the shape beneath them, regardless of how they're arranged. Cade told her that he was not in any serious operational sense a diplomat. He was a secondary linguistic consultant. He said this in Velar using the closest available grammatical construction, which didn't have an exact equivalent for bureaucratic job titles, but managed to convey the sense of someone who reads documents in rooms adjacent to where decisions are made. The translation produced a phrase that in Velar was almost identical to the idiomatic expression for a person who stands near a fire to stay warm without being responsible for the wood. She found this very funny. Sirrus asked him something else. This one came in a different register entirely. Not diplomatic, not formal. The kind of question someone asks when they're genuinely curious about the person sitting across from them. She asked him what Earth sounded like. Cade looked at her. He'd been asked many things about Earth in professional contexts. Political structures, trade capacity, strategic positioning. Never what it sounded like. He reached for the Velar grammatical form for sensory memory. The construction used when a speaker reaches back for something held in the body rather than the mind. He told her that Earth sounded like overlap. He told her this in Velar, reaching for the construction that described not a single sound, but the experience of many sounds existing simultaneously without canceling each other out. Velar had 3 separate constructions for different kinds of simultaneity. The one he chose implied each layer was complete in itself and also part of something larger. The way a chord was not merely notes happening at the same time, but notes choosing to mean something together. She listened with the quality of attention she'd been giving him since the moment he'd first spoken. Not the performed attention of ceremony. The real kind. The kind that cost something and gave something back. He told her about rain on transit infrastructure, the specific percussion of water on elevated rail lines, about conversations that happened beneath it, people raising their voices by exactly the amount required and no more, the whole system self-calibrating without coordination. He told her about the overlap of languages in market districts, 6 or 7 running parallel on any given afternoon, none of them canceling the others. Sirrus, when he finished, was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that Sarath Prime sounded like sequence, that the Sarath had built their cities with acoustic intention, sound moving through the architecture in a designed order, each district completing a phrase before the next began. She told him this in the personal disclosure register, which meant she was choosing to share it. They sat for a moment in the specific companionable quiet of 2 people who have just exchanged something real and are allowing it to settle. The laugh this time was longer. It arrived with a companion, a slight forward movement, the body agreeing with what the voice was doing. Cade observed this with the part of him that was always helplessly doing linguistics. Noted that Sarath physical expressiveness during genuine amusement involved a particular orientation toward the source of the humor. A kind of turning toward that was distinct from the polite attention of formal engagement. She was turned toward him entirely. And then the window shattered. Cade didn't think. Thinking took time. Time measured in fractions of seconds that determined whether you walked away from a moment or bled out in it. He moved, threw himself across the space between his seat and hers, wrapped one arm around her shoulders, pulled her down and forward as the rifle crack echoed through the hall. They hit the floor together. His shoulder exploded. Not metaphorically. The actual sensation of something moving through meat and bone at velocities the human nervous system wasn't designed to process as anything but catastrophic damage. He'd been shot before. Kepler Station, 6 years ago. Different caliber. Same essential message. Someone wanted him dead. This time they'd settled for his shoulder instead of his helmet. He took the upgrade. Sirrus made a sound beneath him. Not pain, surprise. Her hands came up, pushed against his chest with strength that reminded him she wasn't human and didn't need his protection. but he'd given it anyway. And somewhere in the chaos of pain and adrenaline and the distant sound of people screaming, he felt something shift. Not in the room, in the space between them, a connection forming that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with the decision he'd made in the half-second between seeing danger and becoming a shield. Movement to his right, two figures in maintenance uniforms. Wrong posture. Wrong speed. The kind of wrong that screamed training to anyone who'd spent time watching people who knew how to kill. Cade pushed himself up. Left arm useless. Right arm still functional. Vision narrowing at the edges the way it did when blood loss started making editorial decisions about what was important. The first assassin came at him with a blade. Cade stepped inside the arc, took the strike on his dead arm, felt nothing because that arm was already screaming and had no bandwidth left for new complaints. Drove his right elbow into the man's throat, followed through, felt cartilage collapse, kept moving. The second one was smarter. Hung back, had a pistol. Cade was already moving when the shot came. Dropped low. The round passed through the space where his chest had been and punched into the obsidian floor with a sound like broken teeth. He closed the distance. 3 years of studying language hadn't erased 6 years of Marine close-quarters combat training. That training lived in his muscles, in the reflexes that didn't consult with his brain before deciding that survival required violence. He caught the gun hand, twisted, broke the wrist. The pistol clattered away. The assassin tried to pull back. Cade didn't let him, drove his forehead into the man's nose. Once, twice, until the resistance stopped. Silence returned to the hall. Different silence than before. This one had witnessed something, had opinions about what it had seen. Cade straightened, swayed, decided swaying was acceptable if it meant staying vertical. Queen Sirrus was standing, flanked by 4 Sarath guards who'd materialized from nowhere with weapons drawn. Her eyes were locked on him. That luminous amber gaze tracking across his shoulder where blood was making abstract art on his dress uniform. She said something in Valar. Cade's brain, operating on reduced oxygen and shock, needed 3 seconds to parse it. She'd said, "You took a bullet meant for me." Not a question, an observation, the kind delivered in a tone that suggested she was still processing the implications. He wanted to say something clever, something that would diffuse the moment or at least redirect attention away from the fact that he was bleeding on her floor. What came out was, "Yes, ma'am." His knees decided they were done supporting his weight. He felt himself going down, felt hands catch him. Strong, careful. Smelled something like winter metal and electricity, the distinctive scent of Sarath physiology up close. Sirrus had caught him, a queen, warrior caste, 2.1 meters of muscle and bone that could have let him fall and instead chose not to. "Medical bay," she said, "not Villar." Accented English, meant for the guards. Now, the world started going gray at the edges. Cade's last conscious thought was that Arya was going to be insufferably smug about all of this. He woke up to the sound of his own heartbeat, not metaphorically, actual sound, a soft rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Medical monitoring equipment, Sarath design, more organic than mechanical. The ceiling above him was the color of pearl, curved, seamless, the kind of architecture that looked like it had been grown rather than built. "You're awake," Cade turned his head, slowly, testing whether his neck still worked. Queen Sirrus sat in a chair beside the medical bed, close enough to reach out and touch if either of them had been inclined to reach. She looked tired, not the ceremonial exhaustion of someone performing weariness. The real kind, the kind that came from making decisions under pressure and living with them afterward. "How long?" His voice came out rougher than intended. 3 hours. The wound was clean, no major arteries. Your people's medical staff wanted to transfer you to human facilities." A pause. "I told them no." More Cade processed this. Why, Pen? Because the assassins were human. The words landed in the space between them like dropped stones. "Security swept their backgrounds," Sirrus continued, "found connections to a faction within your diplomatic corps. Director Senna Graves. Do you know her?" Cade searched his memory, found a file. Senior official, Colonial Interest Division. Hardliner, on record opposing the ceasefire. "I know of her. She wants this peace to fail." Sirrus's hands rested in her lap. Perfectly still, the kind of stillness that came from decades of discipline. The ceasefire benefits Earth's core worlds, hurts her constituency. So she arranged for my death. Arranged for it to look like your people couldn't be trusted to keep a warrior queen safe in her own ceremonial hall. Restart the war, Cade said quietly. Restart the war. Silence settled between them. Different quality than the ceremonial silences of the receiving hall. This one had weight. Shared understanding. The recognition that they were both pieces in someone else's game and had just been violently reminded of it. Sirrus reached out. Her hand hovered above his shoulder for a moment, not touching, asking permission without words. Cade nodded. Her fingers made contact with the biotech bandage. Warm, gentle, nothing like what he'd expected from a warrior queen who'd spent 12 years leading armies. And then something shifted. Not in the room, in him. A sensation like a door opening, like standing at the edge of something vast and being invited to step through. Images flickered through his mind, not his images. A battlefield. Sarath warriors falling, the weight of command, the loneliness of making decisions that killed people you'd sworn to protect. 12 years of war compressed into fragments of memory. Not his memories, hers. What? He started to ask. Telepathy, Sirrus said quietly. Touch-based for my caste. Normally I control it. But you, she trailed off. Your emotions are loud, Cade Torren. She was reading him. Had been reading him since the moment she'd caught him falling. Every thought, every feeling. The grief he carried from Kepler Station. The 11 brothers he'd watched die. The hollow place in his chest that 3 years of studying a language had tried and failed to fill. She could see all of it. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. The resonance happened when you put yourself between me and the bullet. Sometimes in moments of extreme emotion, my telepathy creates bonds without permission. I should have warned you. Cade lay there, processing. She could read his mind, could see the PTSD that woke him up at 0300 every morning. The survivor's guilt that made him study until exhaustion, because exhaustion was better than remembering. The fear that he'd learned Velar not to understand the enemy, but to find a reason they deserved to live after what they'd done to his squad, all of it. Exposed. He should have been terrified. Instead, he felt something else. Relief. Can I? He hesitated. Can I feel what you feel? She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Her hand pressed more firmly against his shoulder. The door opened wider. He felt her exhaustion, not physical tiredness, soul-deep weariness. 12 years of war she'd inherited at 26 when her father died on the same battlefield that had started this whole catastrophe. 12 years of sending people to die, of making impossible choices, of being alone in rooms filled with advisors who wanted her to be a symbol instead of a person. He felt her surprise when he'd spoken Velar, the shock of being understood, actually understood, not translated, not interpreted, met in her own language by someone who'd learned it not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He felt something else too, something newer, raw, uncertain, interest in him, not as a curiosity, not as a diplomatic asset, as a person who'd made a choice in a fraction of a second that said more than 3 years of studied language ever could. The connection faded. Sirrus pulled her hand back. Her eyes were wide, vulnerable in a way that didn't match the warrior queen from the ceremonial hall. You felt it, she said. Not a question. Yes. They looked at each other. Two people from different species, different worlds, different wars, connected by a telepathic bond that should have been intrusive and terrifying, and instead felt like the first honest conversation Cade had experienced in 6 years. The door to the medical bay opened. Colonel Hendricks entered, face grim, flanked by 2 Marine guards. Lieutenant Torren, he said, voice formal, military precise. I'm removing you from the delegation effective immediately. Cade sat up, regretted it, stayed upright anyway. Sir, Director Graves has presented evidence that you've been compromised. Unauthorized communications with Sarath intelligence, classified information leaks, financial irregularities. Hendrix's jaw was tight. I don't believe a word of it. But until we sort this out, you're off the negotiating team, confined to quarters. Effective now. The words hit like a second bullet. Cade looked at Sirrus. Her face had gone carefully neutral. The mask of a queen who'd learned to hide what she felt. But through the bond still open, he felt her rage. Not at him, at the situation, at Graves, at the machine of politics grinding people into positions they didn't choose. Understood, sir, Cade said. Hendricks gestured to the guards. Escort him to his quarters. They moved forward. Cade stood, swayed, stayed vertical through sheer stubbornness. As he reached the door, Sirrus spoke. In Velar, quiet, meant only for him. Threbamar eth solethna, carvetha ne shora. The guards didn't understand it. Hendricks didn't understand it. But Cade did. It translated roughly as, come to my chambers tonight, alone. In the grammatical form, she'd used the intimate register, the one reserved for people who'd earned trust through action rather than ceremony, told him everything he needed to know about what she was offering. Not just information. Partnership. He met her eyes across the medical bay, nodded once, and let the guards escort him into whatever came next. Cade's quarters were comfortable, secure, functionally identical to a cell. He spent 3 hours staring at the ceiling, cataloging what he knew, what he suspected, what Graves was trying to accomplish. The evidence against him would be meticulous. False, but meticulous. Financial records showing payments from Sarath accounts. Communications logs that never happened, but would look convincing in court-martial proceedings. Enough to keep him locked down. Enough to remove him from the board while the real game played out. Smart. He would have respected it if it wasn't trying to kill 8 billion people. At 2300 hours, the door chimed, not locked, just monitored. They were watching to see if he'd run. He opened it. Dr. Ilara Voss stood in the corridor, face carefully neutral, hands holding a medical scanner that she definitely didn't need. Lieutenant, I'm here to check your shoulder. Her eyes said something else entirely. Cade stepped back. Let her in. The door closed behind her. She waited 5 seconds, then reached into her jacket and pulled out a small device. Pressed it. The air around them took on a faint shimmer. 30 seconds before they noticed the surveillance glitch, she said quietly. Queen Sirrus sent me. She's waiting. Says you know where. I'm confined to quarters. She said you'd say that. Ilara smiled, small, tired. She also said to tell you that humans who never surrender don't let administrative oversight stop them from doing what's right. Cade looked at her. Really looked. Saw the determination in her eyes, the deliberate choice she'd made to become complicit in whatever came next. You could lose your position. I could lose 8 billion people. She held out the scanner. Maintenance shaft behind the environmental panel in your bathroom. Opens to a service corridor. Guard shift changes in 4 minutes. Sirrus's chambers are in the eastern wing. You have a map. I memorized the station layout during the flight in. Of course you did. She moved to the door, paused. Cade, whatever she's going to show you, I think it's going to be bad. Bad enough that she's risking a diplomatic incident to show you privately. So, be ready. The shimmer died. Ilara left. Cade stood alone in quarters that suddenly felt much smaller. He thought about Kepler Station. About 11 men who died because someone up the chain made a bad call. About 6 years of living with the weight of surviving when better people hadn't. He thought about Sirrus's face when Hendricks had removed him from the delegation. The mask she'd worn, the rage he'd felt underneath it through a connection that shouldn't exist. He thought about the war. 12 years. 4 billion dead. He went to the bathroom, found the panel, opened it. The service corridors were narrow, dark, designed for maintenance drones, not humans. Cade moved through them with the careful speed of someone who'd spent 6 years learning that slow was smooth and smooth was fast. His shoulder ached. The biotech bandage was doing its job, but biology still objected to having a bullet pass through it. He ignored the pain. Pain was information. He'd received the message. Didn't need to keep reading it. 4 turns, 2 vertical shafts, 1 security checkpoint bypassed by timing, and the guard's commitment to checking his datapad instead of the shadows. The eastern wing was older architecture, more ornate, the kind of space designed to remind visitors that the Sarath had been building palaces when humans were still deciding whether fire was a good idea. Sirrus's chambers weren't guarded. That should have been his first warning. The door opened before he touched it. She stood in the threshold, changed out of ceremonial dress into something simpler. Dark fabric that moved like water. Hair unbound, eyes that tracked him with the focused intensity of a predator, deciding whether you were threat or prey. You came, she said. You asked. She stepped back. He entered. The chambers were vast, open. One wall was transparent, overlooked Sarath Prime rotating below like a jewel in black velvet. The planet was beautiful. Blue-green continents, silver oceans, cities that glowed with bioluminescent architecture visible from orbit. 50 million people lived in the largest city. Cade had read the briefing files, knew the population density, the cultural significance. The fact that losing that city would be losing the heart of Sarath's civilization. Sirrus closed the door, touched a panel. The room's lighting shifted, went from ambient to something softer, more intimate. "I'm going to show you something," she said quietly. "After you see it, you'll understand why I didn't go through channels. Why I couldn't let your Colonel Hendricks or my advisors or anyone else control how this information was delivered." She moved to a display console, called up files with gesture commands that left light trails in the air. 12 years ago, she said, the war began. Official records says it started with a trade dispute, escalated into violence. Both sides dug in. 4 billion people died fighting over resources and territory and pride. She pulled up a document, text in Valar and English, side by side. Official record is a lie. Cade moved closer, read the Valar first, then the English translation. They didn't match, not even close. The Valar version was a formal request for clarification on trade terms. Polite, standard diplomatic language. The emotional register was careful, respectful. The English translation made it an ultimatum, threatening, the kind of language that demanded response. Your translator, Sirrus said, was a man named David Reeves, working for the diplomatic corps for 15 years. Excellent reputation. Perfect record. She pulled up another file, video footage, grainy, enhanced by Sarath surveillance systems. David Reeves in a private meeting, talking to someone whose face was deliberately obscured, taking payment, digital currency transfer logged and timestamped. He was paid to mistranslate, Sirrus continued, not by us, by a human faction that wanted war. Wanted it because war is profitable, because conflict drives military spending, because some people get rich while billions die. Cade felt something cold settle in his chest. You've known this for 12 years. I've known for 11 years and 11 months. Her voice was hollow. Found the evidence 3 weeks after I became queen. After my father died on the battlefield created by this lie. I wanted to reveal it. End the war immediately. Why didn't you? Because my generals told me it would make the Sarath look weak. Make it seem like we'd been manipulated. They said we should fight until we won. Until we could reveal the truth from a position of strength. She looked at him, eyes raw with something that might have been shame. I was 26, grieving, terrified of making the wrong choice. So I listened to men who'd spent their lives fighting. And 4 billion more people died while I waited for the right moment. Silence filled the space between them. Cade understood, saw the trap she'd been caught in, the impossible mathematics of war. Stop now and look weak. Keep fighting and prove strength. Except the cost of proving strength was measured in millions of lives. Why tell me, he asked. Why now? Because you're the first person who learned our language to understand us. Not to use us, not to manipulate us, to understand us. She stepped closer. And because the bond we share, I can feel your intent, your truth. You're not capable of the kind of deception that started this war. She reached out, took his hand. The telepathic connection flared. He felt her desperation, her hope, the bone-deep exhaustion of carrying this secret for 12 years while watching people die for a lie. He felt something else too, the way she'd felt when he'd thrown himself between her and the bullet. The moment she'd realized that a stranger, someone from the species she'd been fighting for 12 years, had decided her life was worth dying for. It had changed something in her, broken through the isolation of command, the loneliness of being a warrior queen who couldn't afford to be human. We end this, Cade said quietly. Tonight, we release the evidence, both sides simultaneously. Graves can't suppress it if it's everywhere at once. Your career, Saul, is already over. He smiled. Then, might as well make it count. Sirrus nodded, pulled up another interface, started composing a data package. Files, video, authentication codes. Everything needed to prove the war was born from manufactured conflict. We'll need your Dr. Voss, she said. Someone on the human side to verify the data. Someone trustworthy. Alara can... The alarm cut through his words like a blade. Not a quiet alert. A station-wide emergency broadcast. The kind that meant something catastrophic was in progress. Sirrus's personal communicator lit up. She answered it, listened. Her face went from concerned to horrified in 3 seconds. No, she whispered. That system was decommissioned. She looked at Cade, eyes wide. Director Graves has activated a failsafe, orbital weapons platform. Pre-war systems she gained access to using stolen military codes from the war's opening months, targeting my capital city. Her voice was shaking, not from fear, from rage. 50 million people, 10 minutes until firing sequence completes. Cade felt the world narrow. 10 minutes, 50 million lives, one choice. Where's the platform? Docking base 7, but Cade, the failsafe, requires manual disarm. Inside the warhead housing, it's, show me. They ran. The corridor outside Sirrus's chambers had transformed into chaos. Sarath guards mobilizing, human personnel being escorted to secure areas. The particular quality of organized panic that happened when professionals realized something had gone catastrophically wrong. No one stopped them. No one had time. Docking Bay 7 was 3 levels down. Cade and Sirrus took the direct route maintenance shaft vertical drop, catch the emergency handholds on the way down. His shoulder screamed. He ignored it. They emerged into the bay. Massive, open to space. Magnetic field holding the atmosphere in place while ships came and went. The weapons platform sat in the center dock. Ugly. Utilitarian. Built in the early days of the war when both sides thought they could win quickly and decisively. Covered in warning labels in 3 languages. Armed and active. The countdown display showed 8 minutes, 43 seconds. Dr. Alara Voss was already there. Face pale, hands flying over a control panel. I can't stop it, she said without looking up. Graves hard-coded the sequence. Remote deactivation is locked out. Someone has to manually disarm the warhead. But Cade, she looked at him, eyes desperate. The warhead housing is in vacuum, no atmosphere, and the disarm procedure requires someone to override 3 separate failsafes simultaneously. It takes at least 90 seconds. Even with a full EVA suit, the radiation exposure. She trailed off. It's a 90% fatality rate. Even if you survive the exposure, the blast shield needs to vent. The pressure differential will throw you into space before the rescue ships can retrieve you. Cade looked at the platform, looked at the countdown, looked at Sirrus. Through the bond, he felt her terror. Not for her city, for him. The realization that he was about to do something monumentally stupid and there was nothing she could do to stop him. I need an IVA suit, he said quietly, and someone to walk me through the disarm procedure. Cade, you'll die. 50 million people will die if I don't. He looked at Alara, then at Sirrus. I'm a Marine. We don't surrender. We don't leave people behind. And we sure as hell don't let 50 million civilians die because something is hard. 7 minutes, 20 seconds. Alara's hands stopped shaking. She nodded. Suit, locker, base storage. I'll patch through the disarm sequence to your helmet display. Cade ran. The eBay suit was standard issue. He'd trained in dozens just like it. Pulled it on with practiced efficiency. Sealed the helmet. Checked the seals. Through the viewport he saw Sirrus, standing still, watching him with an expression that was pure anguish. Through the bond he felt her trying to say something. Trying to find words in Valar or English or any language that could express what she was feeling. He touched his hand to the glass. She pressed hers against the other side. For 3 seconds, they stood separated by transparent aluminum and the weight of what came next. Then Cade turned, cycled through the airlock, stepped into vacuum. The platform was 30 meters away. He activated magnetic boots, started walking. 5 minutes, 40 seconds. The warhead housing was exactly where Alara said it would be. Locked behind 3 access panels that required authorization codes he didn't have. He didn't need them. He had a plasma cutter from the emergency toolkit. Burned through the first panel, exposed the mechanism underneath. Followed Alara's instructions, patched through his helmet. Override the first failsafe. Physical switch. Heavy. Required both hands. 4 minutes. 10 seconds. Second panel. This one had redundant locks. Took longer to cut. His shoulder was bleeding again. He could feel it. Warm, wet, spreading under the EVA suit. Didn't matter. Third panel. Final failsafe. 3 minutes. 5 seconds. The mechanism was complex. Required simultaneous input on 3 separate interfaces. Designed so one person couldn't do it alone. Cade wedged himself against the housing. Used both hands and 1 foot. Pressed all 3 simultaneously. The countdown stuttered. Stopped. 2 minutes. 58 seconds, frozen on the display. Disarmed. Cade let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. And then the housing vented. Emergency pressure release. Safety protocol. Designed to prevent thermal buildup. The blast hit him like a wall. He flew backward. Magnetic boots torn free, tumbling through space. No control, no orientation. Just the station shrinking in his vision and the black endless nothing of space rushing in to fill everything else. Through the bond, he felt Sirrus scream. Not sound, pure emotion, transmitted telepathically. The sensation of watching someone you care about and being helpless to stop it. He tried to activate his suit thrusters. Nothing. Damaged in the blast. Tried his emergency beacon. Static. Tried to think of something profound to feel in his last moments. What came was simpler. Regret that he wouldn't get to hear Sirrus laugh again. And then something grabbed him. Metal, strong, a rescue claw extended from a Sarath ship that had no business being this far out from the station. Pulled him back, into the airlock, into pressure, into light. Hands stripped his helmet off. Sirrus was there, face wet, holding him like he might disappear if she let go. You stubborn, impossible. Beautiful fool, she said. Half Valar, half English. All emotion. Did it work? His voice was rough, throat raw from screaming and vacuum. The city is safe. 50 million people are safe. Because of you. She kissed him. Not tentative, not diplomatic, full and desperate and real. The kind of kiss that said everything her language could express and more besides. When they finally broke apart, Cade managed to smile. I think I need another medical bay. The evidence Sirrus had compiled, 12 years of classified files, Chenway's payment records, surveillance footage, went public within hours of the weapons platform incident. Simultaneous broadcast, human networks and Sarath channels. No way to suppress it, no way to spin it. Director Senegraves was arrested 3 days later. Tried. Convicted of conspiracy to commit mass murder, sabotage, and crimes against humanity. The colonial faction she'd represented collapsed within a month. Colonel Hendricks personally delivered the verdict to Cade in the medical bay. You were right, he said. Simply. No ceremony. About all of it. The language, the understanding, He gestured vaguely at Sirrus, who sat beside Cade's bed. All of it. Sir, I'm recommending you for the Sol System Medal of Honor, and a promotion, and a formal apology for doubting you. Hendricks's jaw worked. I spent 40 years in diplomatic service thinking translation was enough. You proved me wrong in 40 minutes. He saluted, turned to leave, paused at the door. Make sure they learn it right, Lieutenant. The language, the understanding. Make sure the next generation doesn't need a crisis to figure out what you already knew. Yes, sir, Cade said. Hendricks left. Sirrus squeezed Cade's hand. Through the bond, he felt her approval, her gratitude, her quiet amazement that humans like Hendricks could change their minds when shown the truth. I think you need a commendation and a court-martial for disobeying orders, and possibly a statue. She helped him stand. But first, medical bay. Later in the medical bay, while Biotech worked on his radiation exposure, Sirrus sat beside him again. My linguists worked through the night, she said quietly. They created a new word for what you did. Cade looked at her. A word, Vrethna. She pronounced it carefully. The tonal register was formal but warm. It means one who builds the bridge before knowing if they'll cross. One who prepares for connection before invitation. One who, she paused, one who takes a relationship seriously before the relationship has formally begun. The same concept she'd used to describe him in the receiving hall, but now permanent, codified, part of the language itself. You're in our dictionary now, she said, and smiled. Arya would be proud. Cade felt something shift in his chest, not pain, something else. She would be insufferably smug, he said. Sirrus laughed, took his hand. The bond hummed between them. Quiet, certain. Sarath, 6 months later, Cade stood in front of a classroom. 6 months later, Cade stood in front of a classroom. 30 Marine recruits, all volunteers for the new Cultural Liaison Corps. Language, he said, isn't just translation. It's understanding. It's seeing the person inside the alien, the humanity inside the enemy. It's the difference between war and peace. He pulled up a display, showed them the Valar alphabet. You're going to spend 3 years learning this. It's going to be hard, frustrating. Some of you will quit, but those who make it through, he paused, looked at the faces watching him. Young, determined, ready to do something that mattered. You'll save lives, not with guns, with words. After the class, he walked back to his quarters, not on the station anymore. Earth, new embassy complex built to house the joint human-Sarath diplomatic mission. Sirrus was waiting, changed out of ceremonial dress into something comfortable, reading reports on a datapad, looked up when he entered, smiled. How were the recruits? Terrified, excited, exactly how they should be. She set the datapad aside. patted the seat beside her. He sat. She leaned against him. Their telepathic bond had settled in the months since the crisis. No longer overwhelming, just present. A constant awareness of each other, the shape of their emotions, the way two people could be together without words. Arya sent a message, she said, wants to know if you're ready for the next language. Which one, Cathari? She says it's similar to Valar in structure. Should only take you 3 years. Cade laughed. Tell her I'm in. Outside the window, the lights of the embassy compound glowed warm against the night. Human and Sarath personnel working together, building something new, something better. The war that had killed 4 billion people was over. It had ended because one soldier refused to stop listening, because one queen chose to trust instead of fight, because in the space between two species learning to speak the same language, they'd found something worth more than victory. They'd found peace, and in finding peace, they'd found each other. Cade closed his eyes, felt Sirrus's warmth beside him, the bond connecting them, the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Hey, Sirrus said softly. Thank you for learning my language, for saving my people, for being you. He opened his eyes, looked at her. Thank you, he said in Valar, for being worth learning for. She smiled, kissed him, the kind of kiss that was both greeting and promise. Outside, the stars turned. Inside, two people who'd started as enemies sat together in comfortable silence. And somewhere in a training facility, 30 recruits struggled with their first Valar pronunciations. Making mistakes, correcting them, learning slowly that understanding wasn't weakness, it was the strongest thing humans had ever learned to do.